On May 1, 1931, as dawn broke over Manhattan, the Empire State Building stood higher than anything humanity had ever built. At 1,250 feet, it pierced the clouds like a challenge to gravity itself. That evening, its lights were switched on in a carefully staged ceremony meant to reassure a shaken nation that America was still strong, still unstoppable. Newspapers called it a triumph of engineering. Politicians praised it as a symbol of progress. But inside the building, the echo of footsteps told a different story. The offices were empty, the corridors were quiet, and the most expensive structure in the world had opened its doors into economic ruin. The building did not fail because it lacked vision or innovation. It failed because it was born into collapse. By 1931, the Great Depression had already hollowed out the American economy. Banks had failed. Businesses were closing at record speed. Companies that survived were downsizing, not leasing premium office space in a luxury skyscraper. The Empire State Building was designed for prosperity, but it opened into desperation. Tenants simply did not exist. Within months, the public gave it a nickname that captured its humiliation: the empty State Building. Entire floors remained unlit at night. Elevators ran nearly vacant. Rental prices dropped sharply, yet still few companies committed. For years, less than a quarter of the building was occupied. The irony was impossible to ignore. The tallest monument to American capitalism was financially unsustainable. What kept the building alive was not business, but spectacle. The observation deck, an afterthought during design, became the tower's lifeline. For $1, visitors could ride elevators to the top and look out over a city struggling to survive. Tourists, jobless workers, and families escaping the heat filled the deck. In some years, ticket sales generated proof that the building's real value was not productivity, but symbolism. People paid not to work inside the Empire State Building, but to stand above the collapse and imagine something better. The origin of the building itself was rooted in ego, rivalry, and timing. In the late 1920s, New York City's skyline became a contest of dominance. Height equaled power. Developers competed not for efficiency, but for records. John J. Raskob, a former executive of General Motors, wanted to construct a building that would permanently outshine every rival in the city. The goal was not subtle. It was to win, visibly and permanently. Speed became the project's defining principle. When construction began in 1930, planners pursued a pace never before attempted. Steel arrived with military precision. Crews worked around the clock. At peak efficiency, the building rose at a rate of 4 to 5 floors per week. Newspapers celebrated the speed as a marvel of modern organization. What they rarely discussed was the cost. Thousands of men worked on the structure, many of them immigrants or laborers with limited options. Safety regulations were minimal by modern standards. Harnesses were rare. Helmets were inconsistent. Steel workers walked narrow beams hundreds of feet in the air, with nothing beneath them but the streets of Manhattan. Riveters endured intense heat, deafening noise, and constant exposure to falling tools and molten metal. Accidents were routine. Injuries were expected. Death was treated as an unfortunate but acceptable expense. Official records list 5 worker deaths during construction. Historians have long questioned this number. Documentation was incomplete. Many workers were never properly recorded. If a man fell and died days later in a hospital, he often disappeared from the count. There were no formal investigations, no memorials. The workforce replaced the fallen without pause. The schedule mattered more than the names.
When the Empire State Building opened, its problems did not end. They transformed. As the Depression deepened, the tower became a silent witness to desperation. People arrived at the observation deck seeking escape, not inspiration. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, suicides from the building became frequent enough to alarm management. Newspapers reported the incidents briefly, often with restrained language. The building responded pragmatically. Guards were stationed, railings were raised, fences were installed. There was no public reckoning, no acknowledgement of despair. The goal was containment, prevent disruption, protect the brand, keep the elevators running. On July 28, 1945, tragedy arrived from the sky. A U.S. Army B-25 bomber, flying in heavy fog, became disoriented while approaching Newark Airport. Unable to see the skyline clearly, the aircraft flew too low over Manhattan. At approximately 9:40 a.m., it crashed into the Empire State Building between the 79th and 80th floors. The impact was catastrophic. Offices were torn apart, fuel ignited instantly, fire ripped through multiple floors. One engine punched completely through the building and fell onto the street below. Another engine dropped down an elevator shaft, snapping cables and plunging into the basement. Amid the destruction, an elevator operator survived a fall of over 70 stories, cushioned by tangled cables, one of the most remarkable survival stories in modern history. 14 people were killed, many more were injured, and yet, structurally, the building endured. Fires were brought under control within hours. Engineers assessed the damage. Repairs began immediately. 2 days later, the Empire State Building reopened. New York absorbed the disaster and moved forward with astonishing speed. The emphasis was clear. The city would not stop. As decades passed, the Empire State Building was steadily transformed. Its history was simplified. Its dangers were softened. Films turned it into romance. Media turned it into iconography. Floodlights washed it in color. Security gates and scanners replaced open lobbies. The building became safer, cleaner, and more controlled than ever before. What never changed was the absence of acknowledgement. There is no comprehensive list of construction deaths, no official count of suicides, no permanent memorial for those killed in the plane crash. The Empire State Building became immortal, not because it remembered, but because it forgot. Today, millions of visitors pass through its doors every year. They admire the view, they photograph the skyline, they consume the image of endurance and greatness. Very few are told that this building was once ridiculed as a failure, haunted by despair, scarred by fire, and built through sacrifices that were never fully recorded. The Empire State Building stands not only as a triumph of engineering, but as a record of ambition without pause, a structure that survived economic collapse, human tragedy, and war by prioritizing continuity over commemoration. The steel remains, the skyline remains, and the people beneath it remain largely unnamed.